say, well, continue. Great. All right. Well, thank you to everyone who is joining us from wherever you are joining us. I'm sorry we cannot do that in person. It would allow me to officially enhance the applause that I think Shelby deserves for this activity. So Shelby Scott is our speaker today. Shelby came to the University of Tennessee after completing a degree in a bachelor's degree in uh, what I guess was one of the earliest formal biomathematics programs established at, in this case, at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. And Shelby did her work with Erin Bodine, who was actually one of our former PhD students that Suzanne Lenhart and I co-mentored. After coming to us from Rhodes, Shelby became a peer fellow here. Peer was a program supported by external support, and it's a program for equity and excellence in research. And Shelby has certainly demonstrated her capability to carry out all the goals of that program, which were to, in particular, incorporate quantitative approaches, in this case, in the life sciences. After that, in addition to that very competitive fellowship, Shelby was able to win a national fellowship from the National Defense Science and Engineering graduate program. And I believe is perhaps the only one who has ever gotten that program to support research on gun violence. So we're very pleased that she's been able to do that. She brings to us a wealth of interdisciplinary interests and experience. She's published two research articles as well as an article on education. And she was also the co-organizer for what I think is the first workshop ever held on the mathematics of gun violence, and did a great report from that. And what you may not know about Shelby is that in addition to all of her excellent research, she is someone who will run you under, in the sense of she can outrun anybody I know. And I think the 50 miler is still on the schedule, right, Shelby?
Yes, sir.
But she tells me she'll just meet and say, "Oh yeah, I ran a marathon this morning." So Shelby, it's our great pleasure to have you here joining us, and we thank you very much for spending time here with us at Tennessee and doing a really different PhD as part of our ecology and evolutionary biology program. And she's also finishing a master's in statistics. So Shelby, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Lou. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for being here this afternoon. Some of you near, some of you around the block, some of you across the country. I'm just really honored to have your presence here and to tell you a little bit about my research. Starting with some of the acknowledgements, there will be more at the end, but if I put them at the start, I was at risk of crying at the beginning of my presentation, so I put those at the end. First and foremost, I just want to thank Lou for really trusting me and believing in my potential both to do this project and to be in this program. He's put a lot of trust in my skills, and I deeply appreciate that. To my committee members, Drs. Nina Pfefferman, Sergey Gavrilets, and Suzanne Lenhart, thank you all for your guidance as professors in class and then also as my committee members. Lou mentioned the investigative workshop on the mathematics of gun violence, the participants of which are pictured here. And they helped to develop this project and helped to give me a lot of guidance on where this project would go and where the major holes in literature currently are and how they can be filled. I also want to acknowledge my two writing groups. I'm in a writing group through the Society for Mathematical Biology. So Laura, Joan, and Jess have given me a lot of feedback on drafts that were basically unreadable at the beginning and have given me a lot of the ability to create very, very good manuscripts from things that were not so good to start. Also to my criminology writing group that I met through Twitter. I'm deeply appreciative to all of you for keeping me in productivity when I was not, and also for playing trivia when we stopped being productive for the day. I obviously also want to thank the entire department. I'm really appreciative to every professor that's taught me, every cohort mate that supported me through ecology and evolution, and everyone else who's given me the ability to do this work. And then also I need to acknowledge my funding, which Lou highlighted through the peer fellowship, which was in this NIH grant at the second, and then also the National Defense Science and Engineering Graduate Fellowship. Before I get started, if you need to access my slides for any reason, they're accessible on my academic website. There's a QR code here as well as the website address. And if you have further questions about my work or just want to explore what I've done, all of that is available on my website. Feel free to contact me afterwards via email or however else if you have more questions. So today I'm going to start by talking a bit about my motivation, both the motivation for this work in general, and then kind of how this project even got started. I imagine a number of you are wondering how someone in the ecology department is now studying gun crime using math and stats. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how this project got started, go into an overview of cellular automata models as a whole, which is the type of models that I use in this work, and then answer a number of questions that were brought up by the data sets that I obtained, including whether gun crime is actually an epidemic, the time steps that need to be used, how many of these disease states we need, given that gun crime is an epidemic, the underlying contributors to crime, and then I'll walk through some of the preliminary results of my cellular automata model, talk about some of my conclusions in future work, and finally, I'll open things up for questions and acknowledgements. Starting with the cost of gun violence in the United States. Each year, gun violence costs this country $229 billion, and it contributes to the death of 36,000 individuals and also to the non-fatal injury of 85,000 others. It is the leading cause of death in Black males between the ages of 10 and 24, and 75% of these homicides involve the use of a firearm. This is something that's often talked about in the media, but shockingly, there is a lack of quantitative methods that have been applied to this. In 1993, Arthur Kellerman, who ironically went to Rhodes when it was still Southwestern at Memphis, so we've got this tie to each other, found that having a gun in the home statistically increases the risk of a homicide occurring in the home, which may seem like a logical conclusion, but in slight response to this and some other studies that were going on, in 1996, Congress passed the Dickey Amendment, which said that no federal funds could be used to promote or advocate for gun control. And this was written into the CDC funding appropriations, but it's also been written into the NIH funding appropriations since then. And down here in this plot, on the x-axis, we have the mortality rate per 100,000 people versus the publications in thousands. And so things like cancer and heart disease up here have fairly high mortality rates, or have high mortality rates and high publication levels. And then down here, you have things like hernias, which have fairly low mortality rates, but kind of mid-range publications. And then down here in orange, you have gun violence, which has a mortality rate similar to that of hypertension and liver disease, but it has far fewer publications. And in the first chapter of my dissertation, I reviewed the literature that is existing about these quantitative models of gun crime and gun violence. And I broke down types of mathematical models into these 6 types, and also these statistical models into 6 types. And visually, you can observe that there are these holes in the literature. I divided it into these 4 different categories, looking at the spatio-temporal distribution of gun violence and gun crime, the impacts of constraining gun availability, the effects of different population characteristics, and then also intervention attempts and their impacts. And we've got a few categories that have no literature, and specifically this type 2 of the mathematical models are discrete models in space and time. And so, this work that I'm doing has not really been done, at least in literature searches that we've focused on. And so if any of you are looking for future research questions, there are these grand holes in the literature that are looking to be filled. I also want to talk about the individual cost of gun violence. So I work with data, but behind each and every data point, there is an individual story. Adults that report exposure to gun violence as children show an increased likelihood for a number of different chronic health conditions, as well as risky behaviors. So some of these notable ones are that there's a 9.2 increase in risk of ecstasy use if individuals were exposed to gun violence as children, this 6.5 increased risk of use of substances during sex, and plenty of these other health outcomes. And what's interesting is that this exposure to gun violence is not just being a victim or potentially even a perpetrator. This was done up through teens. This is also seeing gun violence being perpetrated. And so this experience is having major impacts on our children and on our youth, and therefore on their later in life outcomes. Moving specifically to Chicago, there have been past studies that have shown a diffusion of gun crime in both space and time, and put a note in that because we're going to talk more about that later on. But specifically in Chicago, between 2015 and 2016, there was a 68% increase in gun crimes, and this disproportionately affected disadvantaged neighborhoods. And so looking at this graph, we have the years versus the number of gun crimes which occurred. And in 2001 and 2002, it was fairly high. And then we saw this slight decline, maybe a little bump. Things were continuing on a downward trend. And then we saw this uptick in 2016 that continued into 2017 and 2018. And I'll talk more about the specifics surrounding that later on. All of that is to say is that gun crime is a major issue in Chicago. And not only is it an issue there, but it's also often talked about in the media. We see it all the time about the ways in which gun crime is affecting this city. So how did this project come to be? In 2016, I was in Lou's Math 582 class, which was mathematical ecology. And he asked us to come up with a class project, and we talked about some different options, and we all kind of landed on this idea of creating an epidemic model of gun violence in the United States. And I actually found the initial Google Doc notes from that class, and our working objective was to determine methods to reduce gun violence in a region of the United States while maximizing distribution of guns in that area. And we looked at using these SEIR models that are often used in epidemic modeling, adding in some stochasticity, and then using OCT, which stands for optimal control theory, to discover an optimal level of policy to help achieve this overall goal of reducing gun violence. And with some time, I somewhat redirected this working goal and decided to use spatio-temporal modeling to observe this epidemic of gun crime in Chicago, Illinois. And so now we're going to talk a little bit about modeling. Don't let me lose you. Stay with me. So the types of models that I used are called cellular automata modeling, and they exist of a lattice of cells, and each of those cells exists in a given state. And then there are these local rules that govern how these states change over time. They are discrete in both time and space. And so if you're thinking of your potentially simplest cellular automata model, would be something that's one-dimensional with only two states, 0 and 1. And below is an example that I'm going to walk through. So this top row is at time t, and then this second row is at time t plus 1. So that's at the next time step. And the rule here is that at each time step, a given cell will sum the contributions from the two cells to the left and the two cells to the right, and then update its state based on this chart down here. And so let's take this third cell that I was pointing out earlier. And so the contribution from the left is 1. The contribution from the right is 2 ones, so 2 total. So overall, we have a contribution of 3, which then looking down here, that means that the new value will be 0. And in this case, it remains in the 0 state, but I could do this for every one of these and walk through, the update, and you would see this pattern emerge. Now, I'm not going to walk through all of them because we're on a time crunch, But what you see happening is these really interesting patterns emerge. And so Stephen Wolfram created a number of different rules for these cellular automata models. And so this top row would be time t, and then time t plus 1 and moving its way down. And you see in cases like this rule 54, where this almost regular pretty pattern emerges. Meanwhile, you also have things like rule 30, where you may think that a regular pattern is emerging, and then it just results in slight chaos. So this is the type of modeling that I'm choosing to use for this data set. If we want to use this for our data set based on what we've just talked about with cellular automata models, first of all, we need to determine whether gun crime is an epidemic in Chicago. I was just talking to Kimberly's undergraduate students about using epidemic models for all of these different social and crime examples. And the thing is in order to use them, you have to make sure that it's appropriate to use these types of models, whether they have epidemic characteristics. We also need to think about our spatial units. Is it going to be each single block of Chicago? Are we going to grow this out? Is it state by state if these cellular automata models then get larger? And then we also need to think about the temporal units. Are we looking at 1 year at a time? Are we looking at 1 month at a time, 1 hour at a time? All of these things are decisions that have to be made. Also, in that original model, we had the 2 states, a 0 and a 1. What are the cell states here? And then finally, what are the transition rules? Is it adding, the 2 cells to the left and the 2 cells to the right, or do we have some other more complicated rule? So first, we want to look at whether gun crime spreads in both space and time. So this is all to answer the question of whether gun crime is an epidemic. And this is a fairly long equation, but I'm going to break it down a little bit. The overall goal of this method, which is a Bayesian spatio-temporal point process created by Charles Loeffler and Seth Flaxman, the overall goal is to distinguish between crime that's clustered but not diffusing, and crime that is both clustering and diffusing. And so this is kind of trying to determine whether these epidemic characteristics exist in gun crime. All of this is to calculate this conditional intensity, which is lambda. And lambda has triggering kernels for both space, which is our xy here, and time, which is our t. And so now I'm going to split up this equation into different parts and kind of walk through what each of them mean. We first have the background intensity. And so the background intensity is this term here, and it's weighted by this m term. And this background intensity represents crimes that would occur no matter what. This is crimes that would be present whether other crimes had occurred previously or not. But then we're also interested in this Bayesian spatio-temporal component. So what happens if crimes are triggering each other? And I use triggering lightly, but what if there is a correlation between crimes that have occurred in the past and crimes that are occurring now? So we have this theta parameter, and that is the average number of shootings that are triggered by any particular shooting. We have sigma, which is our spatial length scale, which is right here. And then we also have omega, which is our temporal length scale here and here. And sigma is also here. So you see that the temporal length scale impacts the time parameters here, and that the spatial length scale impacts our x and y coordinates, which are our spatial coordinates. Putting this all together in a Bayesian framework. And I want to be clear. So Bayesian frameworks take some underlying idea you have about the data set and then say, and then incorporates it into the model. So rather than just fitting a line, let's say, to a scatter plot of data, you can say, well, I maybe think that this might be exponentially distributed. Can we apply some idea of what we think it might be? So in this way, we use this Bayesian point process method in order to determine whether gun crimes are triggered in space and time. And the overall answer is yes. So we've run this model over multiple different subsets of our data. And for this subset particularly, anything that is an unfilled blue square is a non-triggered gun crime, whereas the blue dots are triggered gun crimes. And so our theta parameter here was 0.93, and that can be interpreted as for every 100 crimes observed at a given location, we would expect the next 93 crimes that occur to be correlated with those initial 100. And we expect these to happen fairly soon after. So our temporal window was 12 hours and within a close geographic radius. So our spatial bandwidth was 1.6 kilometers. All of that is to say is that crime does have these spatial and temporal spreading that happens. And so therefore we can use these epidemic models in order to think about how gun crime spreads in both space and time. So that's the answer to our first question. Is gun crime an epidemic in Chicago? Yes. And now we need to determine our spatial units. And I'm going to give it away in that we choose to use these community areas of Chicago. Chicago is composed of these 77 community areas, each of which have their own characteristics and their own dynamics which occur within them. So what was slightly nice is Chicago set us up for these discrete units by having these community areas in place. And so we also want to think about the temporal units. What's the time scale of this model? How frequently does it need to be updated in order to show the appropriate dynamics or in order for us to study it appropriately? And so the first thing that I want to talk about is whether there are significant events that have impacts on crime. And so for those of you who saw my lightning talk in this seminar a few weeks ago, you may have already seen this. Feel free to reply to an email or look at that text message while I walk through this. So in March 26th of 2020, I got a text from a friend who lived in Chicago that was asking whether the stay-at-home orders changed my data at all. And he was saying that he felt like Chicago had gotten more dangerous. I, at that point, was not looking at it. But I brought this up to Lou as a very interesting thing. And next thing I know, we'd written up a paper and we'd submitted it to Science. Spoiler alert, we did not get published in Science, which was expected. These things happen. This is just how science works, both the journal and the activity. But it is currently in a second round of reviews at PLOS ONE, and we're getting really good feedback on it. So fingers crossed that we get it approved very soon. The takeaway from this is that research ideas can come from anywhere. Also, a quick little paper is never going to be truly quick. We're almost a year out from the initial idea and we're still not published. In the academic world, this is actually very quick, but in some other worlds, this may be very slow. And this then became a dissertation chapter. And so now let's look deeper about the actual impact that this significant event of COVID had on crime in Chicago. On January 24th, Chicago had its very first case of COVID-19. By March 9th, they had declared a state of emergency, and then by March 21st, the stay-at-home order was implemented. And the plots that you're looking at here have the date versus the daily number of crimes. And so this is 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020. And so in 2017 and 2018 and 2019, you maybe see some irregularities of some days where there was low crime and maybe some spikes of slightly higher crime, some outliers here and there. But you can see a general trend. Meanwhile, in 2020, what started out as following this trend, it suddenly dropped off. And so using t-tests, we figured out that this was a significant decline in crime after the stay-at-home order was put in place, which is this vertical line here. But we then had the question of what crime types were kind of causing this. Was it that all crime types were declining? Were there some that were declining more than others? At which point we did this test. So in the dark green is the amount of the average daily crimes that occurred before SAH, or the stay-at-home order. And then in the light green is after the stay-at-home order. And those which are annotated with an asterisk are significantly different. So due to the statistical test, they are significantly different. And while there are some interpersonal crimes that showed significant declines between pre and post stay-at-home orders, the majority of the crimes that we saw showing these dynamics were in statutory, so these other offenses, narcotics and interferences with public officers, and then also in property crimes, so thefts and robberies and criminal trespasses and burglaries. And so we just saw these very interesting dynamics play out about the types of crimes that really were contributing to this. So what other temporal patterns are present in the gun crime? There are many claims about these temporal patterns in Chicago, and we wanted to test whether some of these hypotheses hold. And so these are just a few of the headlines talking about the overall deaths in 2017, the gun violence in the summer, Memorial Day violence, Halloween violence, and MLK weekend. And so going back to this figure from earlier, we wanted to know whether there were yearly patterns in gun crime. You can have some observations, but we wanted to test this statistically. And so the overall question is whether there were yearly patterns in gun crime. The answer is yes. Our significantly higher years are 2001 and 2002, as well as this period between 2016 and 2018. And then we also had significantly lower years right before this spike. And interestingly enough, despite the fact that there are multiple theories, no one's really clear on what caused this major spike in 2016. There obviously were significant events. There was a turnover in administration in 2016. Also, a lot of the Ferguson riots were occurring during this time, but we have not really necessarily nailed down what caused this change. And then let's bring it down one more level. Are there monthly patterns in gun crime? And again, we're using t-tests here. And the only monthly pattern that we see is that February has significantly lower crime than other months. And while there is an experience where during the summer months, we do, see a little bit more crime, this is not significantly different from the other months of the year. Bringing it down one more level, are there daily patterns in gun crime? Do we have these holiday patterns that are talked about in the headlines? So we switched it up and we did an outlier analysis. And then we also did some t-tests because I can't get away from them. And what we found is that New Year's Day, Thanksgiving, and Christmas do show significant differences from the months in which they fall. And so there are some of these patterns, but it's not as much as the media reports. And in our outlier analysis, there don't seem to be patterns in which days are outliers between different years. So we have that New Year's Day shows significantly higher crime than the rest of January, and that Thanksgiving and Christmas show lower crime than November and December, respectively. But when we extend this to a moving average, when we include kind of the surrounding days, these patterns dissolve very quickly. So it's not as though the week of Thanksgiving is incredibly low crime. It's no different than the rest of the month and the rest of the year. And something interesting to note about data quality is that the default in a lot of software for the date, if no date is put in, is 1/1 of that year. And so there is a small chance that some of these patterns that we're seeing on New Year's Day are due to the fact that dates were not filled in and that they were instead auto-filled as January 1st. And again, I don't necessarily have access to how that data is collected. I'm not sure, but that's a theory that I may have about why we're seeing higher crime, quote unquote, on New Year's Day. All right, so we're knocking these questions out. We know that gun crime is an epidemic. We've decided on our spatial units. And as temporal units, I wanted to look at weeks because then we can include that February has lower crime. We can maybe include some of these other significant differences, and we can maybe think about seasonality of gun crime. And so now I want to focus on the cell states. In this map down here, I've divided it into 5 different classes of gun crime event densities. And the thing about that is I chose for it to be 5 different states. I said to ArcGIS that I made this in, I want 5 states of crime, because that's what I'm interested in and because it looks pretty. But that may not be what the data is telling us. So instead, wanted to use a case selection algorithm. So rather than saying, I want 5 classes, a case selection algorithm will tell you the appropriate number of states based on clustering. And so we wanted to find the appropriate number of states, and we ran this case selection algorithm a number of different times and averaged those results of what was recommended. And we found that there are 13 different levels of gun crime. And then you can categorize those into low, medium, and high categories. And that's mostly for model simplicity so that I'm not trying to show 13 different lines at a time. And so, this shows the output of the case selection algorithm, which I'm happy to share with anyone if they're interested. But you can see that 13 is highlighted here. The recommended K for these is slightly higher in terms of the F of K. So this F of K is how close to 1 we're getting. But again, running this over multiple different iterations and running this algorithm multiple times, we do get the output that 13 is the best number in terms of levels of gun crime. All right, so that one was quick in terms of our cell states. And so then we need to think about these transition rules. In that initial model, it was just looking at, is my neighbor a 1 or a 0? And then what's their neighbor next to that? And something that I wanted to look at is what are the socioeconomic conditions that impact the number of gun crime events occurring in these different community areas? You hear about how poverty and education can impact gun crime. And so I wanted to know which of these actually hold. And the factors that I tested from the Census Bureau were crowding, poverty, unemployment, education level, dependence, which is the percentage of the population below the age of 16 and above the age of 65. So therefore, they're dependent on the working class. And then also per capita income. And in order to do this, I used a negative binomial regression with subset selection model. And all that does is it says, we want to fit this data set. We want to fit this distribution of crimes. If we choose every combination and permutation of these factors, which of them best fit that initial data set? And so this model finds that poverty, unemployment, and dependence are correlated with the number of gun crimes occurring in specific community areas. Poverty is positively correlated with the number of gun crimes, as is unemployment. And then, interestingly enough, the percentage of the population that is dependent is negatively correlated with gun crime. And I've been thinking about, why this might occur, and I would love to hear from some of you about why you think this might occur. It may be that if there's a high percentage of the population in that above 65 class, then you have some grandparental care going on, or that life expectancy is generally higher in those areas, and that therefore, it may be that people are better off there. But if any of you have more ideas about why dependence might be negatively correlated with the number of gun crimes, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Okay, so we're thinking about these transition rules, and we're thinking about these internal factors, and then we're also thinking about these neighborhood influences. Remember that the overall goal is to create this cellular automata model where my surroundings impact the amount of crime that is occurring in my neighborhood. And so this is the baseline model. There are 77 cells representing the 77 community areas of Chicago, and we're using a regular lattice. This was encoded in NetLogo. And the user defines how many of these 77 cells are in each crime category of low, medium, and high. So that can be displayed right here. And for this baseline model, I chose 61 in the low category, 15 in the medium category, and 1 in the high category. And that was determined by taking the years 2001 through 2018 of crime in each of the community areas, determining what the density was across those years, and then determining how many of each of those community areas were going to be in each of these categories. The cells in each of those categories are given a random crime density in these corresponding levels, which are 1 through 13. So these states that we came up with given the case selection algorithm. And then those cells are randomly distributed in the lattice. And then there's also this infectivity parameter. And again, this is the baseline model. So this is not including everything, but I'm very interested in the baseline model dynamics. So I'm going to walk you through those. This is a flow chart of kind of how this baseline model runs. And so the overall idea is that if an area is surrounded by high crime, it will increase its crime density. If it's surrounded by low crime, it will decrease its crime density. And if it's surrounded by equal crime, it will maintain its crime density. And so after the model is initialized, each cell will average its surrounding 4 neighbors. So that's your community areas to the north, the south, the east, and the west. And if that average is higher than your current crime density, you're going to become higher crime. And so this is by adding on another crime level. And that crime level could be incremented by this B or beta parameter, which I'll talk about in a moment. If your average of the 4 neighbors is equal to your current crime density, you just stay where you are. You stay at your crime level. And then if the average in your surrounding area is less than your current crime density, you're going to move down 1 crime level. And so then each of these cells, no matter what they did, will update their crime level, update their crime category, The counters for the overall model are incremented, and then this model continues and persists till 20 years have passed. So I'm going to walk through 3 different scenarios that I've found, focusing on this beta infectivity parameter. And so this is the result of running 20 years of this model with our initial low number of cells at 61, our medium at 15, and our high at 1. And those will remain constant across these 3 scenarios. But our beta, or infectivity parameter, is equal to 2. So that says that if the area surrounding me is higher crime than my area, then I will go up by 2 crime levels. We get this really interesting kind of nonlinear oscillations between the different crime types. And so you'll see that at the beginning, low crime, which is in green, and medium crime, which is in yellow, they're kind of fighting with one another. And then at one point, low crime declines and medium crime increases, and then suddenly high crime shows up and it comes through, and then medium crime and high crime are kind of battling with one another for a little while. And at some point, high crime dies out, and then low crime again comes in and is battling out with medium crime, and then high crime comes back in. And so you see this really, really interesting behavior that happens when you have this infectivity parameter set to 2. Okay, so what if we have it set to 1? What if there is as much of an impact of being surrounded by low crime as high crime? And I want to be clear that when crime has reached 0, that no longer counts as low crime. It's then no longer recorded by the plots. And so we see that initially there's a spike in low crime, and there's maybe a little bit of medium crime, and high crime never does anything. So if there's as much of an impact of being surrounded by low crime areas as high crime areas, everything goes to low crime. And then, conversely, because we like to play with parameters, what happens if beta is set to 3? What happens if we jack it up? We see that low crime maybe has some attempt at winning out, but it never actually sits anywhere, never actually battles with medium crime. Medium crime and high crime maybe have a little bit of a battle, and then high crime persists for the rest of the 20 years. And I found this really interesting looking at the model initially. I was trying to decide, what does this mean if we're looking at this from a reality standpoint? So this model behavior changes drastically with changes in our infectivity parameter. And this beta parameter again says, how impactful is it to be surrounded by other high crime communities? And it seems as though if, it's very impactful, then it's making a significant difference on how much crime persists in Chicago as a whole. So therefore, if the infectivity of gun crime makes this much of a significant difference, how might we be able to decrease it? And there are a number of different intervention attempts that people have tried to use, and this includes policing strategies such as predictive policing and strategic subject lists. And I'm not going to go into the potential damage that can be caused by some of these policing strategies, but they have been used in a number of these communities. There are also a number of violence interruption programs that have occurred throughout the United States, one of which is Cure Violence. And part of this Cure Violence model is to change the norms and to also have a behavior change of highest risk individuals. And then also mostly this detection and interruption. So if you think that crime may outbreak in a certain community, how do you then interrupt it, and how do you stop it from occurring? Then there's also the idea of community changes. There was a study done in Youngstown, Ohio, which had a higher population for a while and then kind of declined due to some other things that were happening in the community. And there were all of these vacant lots that were full of debris. And so what they did is they went in, they cleaned out the debris, they mowed down all of the overgrown grass, and they did what they called greening these different lots. So they just laid down grass, made it look nice. And they found that in all of the treated areas that had experienced this greening process, there were reductions in crime. And so there are community changes that go well beyond, taking away guns or putting more police on the streets that can really impact the ways in which crime interacts in these communities. And so there are obviously additions to the baseline model. There are these temporal variations of, what if February did show the same amount of crime as other months? What if instead of July showing these slightly higher amounts of crime, we decreased it a little bit? What impact does that have on the model? There's also the socioeconomic conditions. If we decrease poverty in Chicago by 10%, how does that change the amount of gun crime that we're seeing in these communities? And then also reductions or increases in stochasticity. Right now, I've got this kind of randomness that's inherent to the model where I say, we need 61 cells in the low crime category, but then within that, the number of cells in each of those levels is chosen randomly. So it could be that in a given simulation, everything in the low crime category is right on the verge of being in the medium crime category. And so then as these interactions are occurring, that shifts a lot of those cells into the medium category is winning out versus something where, all of the low crime category cells are then in, right at the bottom. And then you see this persistence of low crime. So reductions or increases in stochasticity could result in some really interesting dynamics. And then also applications of specific interventions in both time and space. If I can say, hey, in that one crime area, reduce the poverty by 20%, and we'll see these different dynamics emerge. We'll see that the high crime areas never went out versus, putting a bunch of money into an area that's going to be low crime no matter what you do. And then also a future edition would be of the GIS data. If you think back to that original map of Chicago, you have these irregular shapes, you have some larger areas, you have some smaller areas. How does that impact how crime spreads across these borders? Is it more likely to spread if you're more connected or less likely? So these are some of the additions to the baseline model that I'm really interested in pursuing and determining, what impact this might have. And so I want to talk through some of the model conclusions that I figured out from all of these submodels, from all of these small statistical tests. So the first one was whether gun crime shows epidemic characteristics in Chicago. And the answer is yes. Gun crime both clusters and diffuses in both space and time. And so it does have some of these epidemic properties. And then secondly, are there temporal patterns of Chicago's gun crime? Yes, but sort of. We do know that significant events impact gun crime patterns. Specifically with the stay-at-home orders, we had this huge change in the way people were behaving and their routine activities. And so we did see that that had a significant impact. But there's some inflation of the broader observations of specific holidays that contribute to gun crime and specific times of year. In terms of the different crime levels, we found that there were 13 different crime levels present in Chicago. And then in terms of the factors that contribute most to crime spread, in that socioeconomic condition study that I did, we found that poverty, unemployment, and the percentage of dependents did have significant impacts. But then in our model, this interesting infectivity parameter did seem to have a major impact, which could lead to future policy decisions. And I want to talk about some of my overall research conclusions. I've been working on this for, the last 4-ish years, 4 to 5 years. And so the first thing that I'll say is that gun crime and gun violence are major public health concerns in the United States, and they need to be treated as such, and our legislators need to treat them as such. There is also a lack of research on gun crime in the United States. There are all of these holes in the literature that would be amazing if people would come in and do some of this research. Also, there's far more contributing to gun crime outside of availability of guns. You listen to people talk a ton about the Second Amendment, how the Second Amendment is going to be the thing that increases or decreases gun crime, but there are all of these different factors. And so finally, this is all incredibly complicated. And while evidence-based policy is the overall goal, it may not be as easily accessible as we're making it be. And so we need all kinds of people working on these problems. In order to have this optimal reduction in gun violence, we need researchers. And that includes, I'm an ecologist, but I have a number of connections who are epidemiologists, and then obviously my criminology friends and public health practitioners, psychologists, and sociologists But we also need these non-academic experts. We need policymakers. We need public servants. We need law enforcement to buy in to what we're doing in this research. And then finally, we need community members. We need our cultural leaders, our community leaders, past offenders and potential offenders to have a say in these policies that are being created. I am a white woman living in Knoxville, Tennessee, who's doing research on gun crime in Chicago. I have a very limited view of what's actually happening on the ground. And so by working with all of these groups and not siloing ourselves into, the epidemiologists are working in this group and the law enforcement officials are working in this group, by bringing together all of these people, I do think that we can have a major impact on how gun violence spreads throughout these communities. And so that's kind of my overall takeaway. Is like, I can do all that I can, but we need more people working in this and more people working together in order to solve this major problem. Okay, and so now I have some further acknowledgements. So first and foremost, I have to acknowledge my family, both academic and, my biological family. I was raised in a family that taught me to ask questions. I was raised in a family that always allowed me to be at the adults table and never stuck me at the kids table. And so I was always allowed to ask questions and engage in discussion. And there's no way that I would be where I'm at today without my family's influence, starting with my grandmother and working down. And then also my immediate family. I'm just so grateful to them for allowing me to disappear on Christmas Eve to work on paper corrections, or, wake up early a few days before Thanksgiving in order to finish a class project. I'm just so thankful to each and every one of you for loving me and supporting me through this. And specifically my mom for all she's done for me. I'm not going to keep talking because I'll definitely cry. But then I absolutely need to acknowledge my academic family. So at Rhodes College, I had Erin Bodine and Rachel Jabali, who's now at Colorado College. And they both showed me what a academic looked like. They were incredible role models and incredible examples who believed in me from day one and have mentored me ever since. Also in that group is Dr. Carrie Diaz-Eaton, who met me when I was 19 at my very first conference and has given me opportunities and mentorship ever since, from including me in the Society for Mathematical Biology education subgroup, to inviting me to talks, to letting me, share her hotel room in Sydney, Australia. She's just been so helpful to me, and I'm so thankful for the mentorship of every single person who has guided me academically. And then I always say that a dissertation is a solitary event, but getting through grad school is a team sport. So thank you to all of my teammates who have gotten me through this, people who have gone for runs with me, people who went for beard and beer market runs in costumes with me, or let me run the Crafty Grenade race for the last year and a half. I'm so grateful to all of you. And then one of my best friends always says to go where you're celebrated, not where you're tolerated. And so I need to acknowledge all of the people who've made me feel celebrated over all of these years, and who have believed in my potential and who have helped nurture me through it. And finally, I want to thank the entire city of Knoxville. You're beautiful and wonderful as a city, and I've enjoyed falling in love with this city over the last 6 years. And so with that, I will gladly take any questions.
Let's officially thank Shelby. So feel free to give a round of applause, however feasible for you to do. Okay. So it's time for questions, and of course, we're going to let people unmute. But if you have a question, feel free to just put it. You can either put it in the chat, okay? So let me first start with one in the chat, and let's see who this came from. Hard to tell. Looks like along with a number of congratulations, Lucas has a question. Lucas, do you want to unmute to ask it?
Sure. Congratulations, Shelby, for the presentation. Really good, and the work really nice. So I was just wondering because most of your research, most of your data coming from Chicago, and I was kind of reading recently about the culture of honor, which is people coming from this background. They are more prone to use violence if they feel insulted. And maybe the best example for that is the Help Human cause in the Appalachian that almost created a civil war. And so in Chicago, I don't think most of the people coming from this background, from the culture of honor, but I was wondering how maybe the spatial temporal correlation in your results would maybe changing if you're looking maybe in another place in the United States in which there is this kind of culture of honor.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Lucas, and something that I'm incredibly interested in. You know, I'm looking only at Chicago, but Chicago has a certain view of guns and gun violence. There was a documentary asking people why they carry guns, and it's the idea of a lot of them said, you know, well, I have to carry one because someone else is carrying one, and so it's for self-defense. Versus potentially in more southern regions where it is this kind of like guns are for collecting and guns are to show off or to use in hunting, in more rural areas for protection of property. I imagine that there would be some really interesting spatial and temporal dynamics that would occur based on how certain areas feel about guns and why they are using them. And so with, you know, potential extensions to this model, you can't just take, you know, what I did in Chicago and apply it to, you know, Johnson City, Tennessee. There's going to be different things at play. But this does kind of create a framework of questions to be asked about how this crime is spreading in space and time. So yeah, that's a really good point and a very interesting question. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Shelby. You could also mention that, you know, the COVID crime included several different cities, but Suzanne has a question. Suzanne, you want to ask?
Yeah, maybe I missed this, but you showed the statistical model, you know, and then you simulate. I wasn't sure exactly how you use the statistical. Did you feed back some ideas from the statistical model into the simulation models? Because you had all these like, but yeah, can you elaborate on that? Yeah.
Yes, so all of the statistical models that I showed do feed into the cellular automata model. So in thinking about the, you know, number of cell states, that was where the K selection algorithm came in of how many states we need. And in thinking about our time steps and what dynamics we needed over time, that was where the holidays analysis and these temporal patterns played in. And then with this Bayesian spatio-temporal point process, you know, how far is crime spreading in both space and time? That kind of played into the neighborhood dynamics.
I guess I was just trying to understand like the socio-economic part. How did that actually play into it? Or that help you pick the regions that were most vulnerable or something like that?
Yes, so this was not in the baseline model, but in the models where socioeconomic conditions are included. That's a level that's below the number of initial crimes. The socioeconomic conditions in each of those community areas plays into how much crime is initially in a given area. And so then within that, you can also play with the parameters a little bit and figure out whether it's, you know, at the 100% poverty level or whether you reduce it bit by bit. And that's not for each cell, but overall, you know, every cell would have a poverty, an unemployment, and a percentage dependence parameter. And then those could be played with in order to figure out the impacts of those socioeconomic conditions.
And were the cells sort of a certain size, like a zip code or a zip code tabulated area? I mean, did you think about it that way?
So the cells represent these community areas of Chicago, and these have been around since like the 1920s, I believe. And so they are these defined communities, and the crime is reported both by block and then also by community area. Okay. And so I chose to use that because it's a slightly larger region than block.
Oh, okay. And so somehow the economic features you got them at the right level to go with that. Yeah.
Yes. The Census Bureau reports the socioeconomic conditions at the community area level as well.
Oh, okay. Because I normally see them like at zip code tabulated areas and stuff like that. So you can combine them to neighborhoods or whatever. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Suzanne. So there's a question that came in from Missy Scott, but it says it's from Ryan. So I don't know if Ryan's there to unmute or whether I should ask it.
Ryan, do you want to unmute? You can't.
Sure.
You don't have to.
Hi, Shelby. Great to see you.
Hey, Ryan.
See you in a few hours. I guess my question is just thinking about whether, I was struck by, I think, the time series you showed that didn't, had a huge jump between 2015, 2016. But then looking a few years earlier at like the Great Recession, really no statistical or no jump, I guess, in actual crimes, and whether your research considered kind of the substitution effect, thinking maybe of just basic assaults. Did the number of assaults, does it have an inverse relationship to gun crimes and that sort of thing?
Yeah, that's super interesting. Thanks, Ryan. I didn't look at that. I didn't look at whether there was a trade-off, and I didn't look at whether, the overall number of crimes showed similar declines. I want to be clear that the gun crimes that I study are all crimes involving the use of a firearm. So that is assaults and batteries, and then also armed robberies and, a number of these different crimes within, that all just use a firearm. So I haven't broken it down to see whether those patterns existed in all crime types or whether they were just in gun crimes, but that would be a really interesting extension.
Yeah, I think, just from thinking about I'm a policymaker, right? But transportation policy, that's kind of the what do you do about it? The next steps beyond just observing, I guess, that sort of thing. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the hard part, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later, is getting the policymakers to listen to all of the research studies that come out.
Yeah. I mean, I could ask a follow-up about, whether or not the location is correlated with transportation access, but I'll save that for later.
Yeah, we'll talk later, because there's a really interesting study that looked at how the metro system in Chicago basically acted as a through line of crime because people are getting off and on the metro.
Interesting. Yeah, I will follow up with you later about that.
Yeah.
Great job, Shelby.
Thanks, Mom.
Having been on many a subway in Philly, there's definitely a correlation between crime and being on a subway. Yeah. There's a question from Casey Middleton. Casey, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, great job, Shelby. I enjoyed that so much. But I was wondering how you decided on a cellular automata model and how that could maybe be extended to look at interactions that are not just happening locally within a neighborhood, but maybe like gathering hotspots within the city. So you're going to be interacting with people at your church and at your school and things like that. And that's where you kind of share mindsets, and how those hotspots could also be a place that, I guess, spurs these gun crimes. And is that something that could be incorporated into a cellular automata model?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks, Casey. And you have a background in agent-based modeling, so I can then talk about agent-based models with you. To your first question, decided on a cellular automata model because the data kind of led us to. We saw that there were these discrete units that Chicago provides with these community areas, and we saw that discrete time steps would best approximate, what was happening, and that we could look at, the specific weeks versus doing it as a continuous model and just looking at these population changes over time. And then in your question about these gathering locations, there was an interesting study which looked at crime attractors and crime generators. And so you do have places that sell alcohol, which tend to be crime generators because bar fights break out and there are robberies and, public intoxication, things like that. And so when you're talking about these gathering locations, you also see that areas with community centers almost have this radius around the community center where less crime occurs, because it's almost seen as a sacred space a little bit. So it definitely could be extended. You would likely have to decrease the spatial resolution. And so it would need to be a little bit smaller in order to include these gathering locations. But the idea of gathering locations also brings up an interesting question that we talked about yesterday, actually. My friends Joan and Sarah were giving a class, and I listened in on it, on how the people that you surround yourself with impact both your desire to commit a crime, your risk of victimization, and your desire to not commit a crime. So whether that gathering location is a church or a school or a community center versus versus somewhere potentially more nefarious would be a very interesting extension of the model.
All right.
It would be
Thanks,
really
Casey.
cool.
So thanks.
Have you looked at tipping point neighborhoods?
Go ahead, Casey.
Sorry, I don't know how good my Wi-Fi connection is, but tipping point neighborhoods might be really interesting to kind of correlate this with policy, because there's work already going on to look at where these tipping points are, neighborhoods that can be sort of revitalized and moved forward, as opposed to those that the government can just pump money into and not see very much improvement. And so it would be really interesting to see how your kind of middle categories might have overlap with those that are already being moved into. I just wanted to.
Yeah, no, that's one of the things that I would love to test is if you have a high crime community, is there really that much impact of putting a bunch of resources and a bunch of interventions into it versus reducing the middle category? If you can reduce the middle category where it might be easier to put those interventions into play, not only easier, but more effective to put those interventions into play, how does that impact the model overall? So yeah, the idea of tipping point neighborhoods is definitely on the horizon.
All right, thanks for that, Shelby. I'm going to ask one more just to see if anyone else has anything. But I want to ask you may remember there was an editorial in the Knoxville paper that came from a Nashville writer encouraging more research in gun violence. I think that was about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And we had a discussion about it and the need for data as opposed to, quote, research. Do you want to say something about what kinds of data that are not readily available might best inform the building of better models and as moving forward? Kind of summarize maybe a little bit about what we learned from the workshop on that.
Yeah, so if you're interested in some of the further details of this, both on my academic website and on the Nimbus website, there's a full write-up of our Mathematics of Gun Violence workshop. And within that, it talks about some of the holes in the data. I think what's most important is the need to have a consensus about how data is collected and what data is collected across different cities, and what data is made publicly available. We've run into this a number of times as we've been creating this model of, well, in LA, they snap all of the crimes to the corners when they present their spatial data so that you're not looking at one house. But what that causes is someone saying, why are all of these crimes occurring at CVS? Because it's what happens to be on the corner, and there's a bunch of crimes that occurred on that block. So I think the most important thing is a consensus followed by data ethics. I think that there are a lot of ethical considerations that need to be taken into account when collecting this data, because again, people are behind every single data point. In terms of specific data sets, I would love to have access to who owns guns legally. I think that would be really interesting, but we don't have access to that data. And then also I would love for it to be more open, what type of policing is happening in certain areas and what types of interventions are being put into place in these given areas and whether they are effective or not. There's some literature on it, but I think we could really use more.
Okay, thanks. So Lucas asked a kind of follow-up question about locations. Lucas, do you want to ask this again quickly?
Yeah, sure. So there is like some people doing research trying to find which kind of features of the environment could maximize people's willingness to behave altruistically. So like having more churches or more schools. So my question is related with your research. Have you found any kind of specific buildings in which you would find hotspots of crime, or the opposite, like having more churches is going to have less crime?
Yeah, so I haven't looked at the idea that it's people behaving altruistically that causes these hot spots or cool spots, as it may be. And I haven't necessarily done any of this specific work, but if you're interested in it, I'm happy to send you some of the papers where they have looked at these kind of areas that produce almost seem to produce. I'm not going to say that they produce, but areas and types of buildings that are correlated with more crime. And it, it comes down to what types of crimes are occurring. Like burglaries might not occur in commercial areas, and their public intoxication may not occur in incredibly residential areas because that more is going to happen in areas with bars. So there are definitely different crime types that occur in different areas. But in terms of overall crime, I haven't looked at the specific buildings, but there are studies out there that have done so.
Okay, thanks. And Haley has a question. We'll probably end with that one about data quality. Haley?
Hi, Shelly. Good job. So I remember back at Rhodes, and I did a crime study, and one of the problems with my data was that it was self-reported by police. So I was just wondering if you had any idea of that, because they could underreport for some sort of incentive for their department showing less crime. If you knew anything more about that.
Yeah, so specifically for Chicago, the data is available through CLEAR. So it's the Citizen Law Enforcement, and then AR, whatever the AR stands for. But there are citizens that are going through the police beats, and they're paid to do this, but they're going through the police beats, and they're not law enforcement officials. And they're the ones who are taking this data and uploading it. That's not to say that, the police officers don't know that that's how it works and that they're not cheating the system. But that is kind of how Chicago is hoping to get around the bias that might be present in the data that.
Cool, that's interesting.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron.
All right. Well, I think that we've been here for a while. We should let Shelby get back to finishing her dissertation. No, to take some time off. So let's give Shelby a round of applause again and thank her for a great talk. There's been lots of wonderful comments, and Shelby, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I appreciate you all.
Everybody have a great weekend.
We will.